Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and such an honor to be asked to speak to all of you today. Some people I know when elections come around are of the view that we shouldn't encourage people too much, i.e. the politicians. But I'm certainly of the view that politicians are great people who are brave enough to put their names forward and be those people that we will blame for the next 4 years. So I hope today we can provoke a little bit of discussion about how we can encourage people to better connect to our political process. I'm a huge admirer of the work of Maytree and of the work of many of your organizations, which I've watched from afar and sometimes up close for a long time. So as I said, it is a real honor to be here, and thank you all for taking time from your day. So without further ado, I thought I would just dive in a little bit to some of what we're learning about why people don't vote, and how we can begin to turn that around. Now, I think we are post-first coffee, so I'm going to throw a few numbers at you just to set the groundwork. I mean, the trends are well known that voting has been going down in Canada for well over 2 generations. Just to give you a sense of where we're at, 2011, the last federal election, 61% of Canadians voted. That number, 39%, is the number of young people who voted. And actually, one of the biggest reasons why turnout is going down is because young people do never start to vote. So when you hear people talk about why engaging young people is so important, that is why. And that's the election before the 2008 election, so about 60% again. Provincially, not so great. 49% in the last election, 2011, 52% before. Now, municipally overall, 51% of people, of Torontonians voted in 2010. And in the election before that, the one that elected David Miller, it was only 39%, so a reverse in trend. But as Alan said, there are huge variations by community in who votes, and I know Myra's going to talk about that in a bit more detail. We have among the lowest voter turnout of any Western democracy, which is shocking when you think about the wonderful country that we do live in and the fact that people come from all around the world to be a part of this. So why are these numbers the way they are? This is the $10,000, maybe even $10 million, maybe even more question. So what I thought I would do is just talk to you a little bit about what some of the research says, and then a little bit about what some of our experience at Samara is pointing us to. And then we'll have everybody speak to each other in their circles, at their tables, about how we might turn that around. So there's 2 big reasons why people don't vote. The first is access. So this is things that really have to do with the logistics of voting. Things like not knowing where the poll is, not having the proper identification, not knowing how to vote, not being able to travel to the poll, something happened that day, I got too busy, the subway broke down, whatever it is. So access barriers is what these are called. The second big reason, and in our view at Samara, the much bigger reason, is what's called motivation barriers. So this really has to do with people's attitudes and belief towards politics, politicians, and voting. These are the trickier ones, I think, to tackle. So these are things like believing or not that your vote matters, and that it can make a difference. Having interest in politics or interest in candidates, or being sort of excited by what you see or not. Trusting politics and government, or believing that there is a choice among the candidates. So these are the sort of trickier ones to tackle. Our research and some of other people, some of other academics, is pointing to the fact that it actually is motivation often that is the bigger barrier, as I mentioned, than access. And sometimes even when people cite an access barrier, like, oh, I didn't have time to vote, what they're really saying is, I didn't care enough to make the time. So again, it's tricky to, you do what you can with public opinion research, but it's certainly our view that citizens will figure out the logistics of voting if they believe it's important. So of course that begs the question, how do we encourage each other to think about the motivation barriers? Without fail at every election, there are all kinds of people that focus on the access problem. Let's have more polling booths. Let's have, get out the vote advertising campaigns. All these kinds of things are tackling the access problem. And there are access problems, but we do very little, particularly in between elections, to focus on that motivation problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I would say probably 3/4 to 80% of the problem, and not so much about access today. So then it begs the question, why are people not motivated to vote? So we have done a bunch of different research at Samara. One big reason is because a lot of people do have negative experiences with the political system. We conducted a series of focus groups with people who don't vote to talk to them about what matters to them and how that might connect to the political system. And many of them actually pointed to specific examples where they had tried to get help from either a public servant or an elected representative and had been turned away as a result. One of the best and most powerful quotes that came from that, not best, but powerful quotes that came from that was, "The system doesn't care about me, so why should I care about it?" So it's a rational response sometimes. But we also know that people's engagement in between elections isn't great either. For example, we did some research in 2012, and public opinion research, and only 40% of Canadians admitted to talking about a political issue once in the last year. Now, part of that might be that they don't think their schools or their neighborhood issues are political issues, but the point is, not a lot of talk in between elections. And if you're not talking about things and it's not part of your community, then we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that when a politician rolls around 4 years later, it doesn't necessarily connect. It also has to do with building up confidence and a feeling of efficacy and willingness to participate. If you're not talking about things, it is hard to connect that. So again, here we beg the question, what do we do to get at that motivation problem, and how do we help politics become more accessible and interesting for people who have never participated before? Along with my colleagues at Samara, and I'm going to point to John Beebe, who's sitting there with his hands up, we have developed a program called Democracy Talks, together with community organizations, which is designed to encourage young people and newcomers in particular to have conversations about politics in their community, in an environment that they trust, and with their friends and family there. We have a couple of our partner organizations in the room as well. Our friends at AXA, who organized one of the very first Democracy Talks out in Agincourt, probably 18 months ago, and North York Community House, which is so, there we go, thank you, variously distributed throughout the room, and about 14 other organizations. We ran a pilot offering this program, really designed to provide an accessible way for people to participate in political discussions. And what we found will not surprise any of you, of course, and it didn't surprise us. When offered the opportunity, people have lots to say about politics and democracy. They have new perspectives to offer that aren't often part of the debate, and people left energized. The number one comment we had when we asked how can we improve this program was either do more of them or make them longer. We also did a bit of statistical number crunching on the evaluations, and particularly among the people who were the very least interested in politics when they entered. We saw a 54% decrease in their disinterest. So for statisticians, no, I can't say 54% increase in their interest. And almost a 40% decline in people who said they were uncomfortable talking about politics. And that's after just 1 hour of a discussion in an accessible environment. So that was a pretty inspiring outcome. But they also shed some new light on why this question of why people don't vote. So I thought I would just, and how that might change. So I thought I would just share a little bit of that insight with you. One very strong message that came through is that people felt political participation was not something that was seen as valued in Canada. And this struck me as a real shock when you think we're, arguably one of the leading democracies in the world. Second is that voting or mainstream political participation is unlikely to be the first step. So again, back to that access and motivation. When we come at people and say, vote, 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 that isn't always the right first entree. And then the third is that reconnecting citizens to the political process will require a trusted local intermediary to invite their participation, which is, I think, where many of us come in. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but in terms of, what did they mean? Not a Canadian value. Comments that came up, people who were raised in Canada said what a turn off their civics education was. A couple said, it wasn't until I got into my 20s that I realized this stuff mattered. People who had been through the settlement process observed that there was almost no introduction to political or democratic participation. One person talked about actually brought their guide, their citizenship guide, and said, there's more information in here about the beaver than there is about voting. And we was like, oh yeah, good point. It is a mighty creature, but that's perhaps disproportionate. And then people who received communications from government, often partisan little things that come in the mail that we all know, just said, this is not sort of suggesting that we have any kind of intelligent sort of political discourse here. So just across the board, they're like, never really thought this was something that mattered all that much. Second, voting is unlikely to be the first step. For many people, they did not see politics as a way to make change. And of course, for many of us, we know that often it is most of where most of the money, the legislative power comes from political decisions. But for many people, they did not see politics as that. Partially because they didn't have any live examples of politicians willing to engage constructively with them. So there's just a quote to that effect there. Somebody said, "Their rhetoric discourages me from thinking." Some actually, and perhaps rightfully, believe that the system actually works against them and is the cause of some of the challenges that they face. So these are, very, as I said, people have personal experiences which really do challenge their desire to participate that are real. And so that leads to the role of the trusted broker. One of the things we try to do through Democracy Talks is encourage people's own role, encourage them to think about that and develop that. Without fail, every single participant recognized that they had a role, but they struggled to define that in any real way. Probably because they didn't have examples, and we tried a bunch of throwing examples, and people just didn't connect with them. But then when we got talking about the community organizations that had brought them to the table, that is where you started to see things turn around. So overall, and sorry, a couple quotes there just to illustrate that. So overall, these participants issued a challenge to all of us who seek to strengthen the democratic process. One of the challenges we had in our pilot is that although we reached groups who traditionally don't vote or participate in the same numbers as others, the individuals who came to the table often themselves were more interested within their groups. So the challenge, of course, is how do we not only attract communities, but also individuals who may not otherwise participate. So the challenge, of course, is not just how do we bring new people to the table, but how do we go to other people's tables and join in an accessible way. Canada has a wonderful network of community organizations, many in this room, but all across this country, who care and are deeply interconnected to issues going on in communities, healthcare, education, all dedicated to building more vibrancy and engagement in our cities and towns. They know intimately what issues are important to their residents. We have just begun a much larger partnership with North York Community House, yay again, where we are looking to integrate versions of Democracy Talks into existing programs, whether they be cooking classes or English conversation circles, where people are coming for another reason. And it provides a wonderful, I think, opportunity to talk about democracy in a way that they never have before. This just started, I think, well, we've been working on it for a while, but probably about 6 weeks ago, and we've already had about 250 people participate, and I think it's fair to say, and the North York folk will correct me if I'm wrong, that it's been a wonderful experience. It is not only empowering the staff, but also the community members to think about their connection to politics in a new way. There's a couple features there, and I won't spend a lot of time, but it's centered very much on community-based discussion and integrated into existing programs. This allows for a much richer conversation focused on solutions and focused on individuals' roles in advancing those solutions. It isn't a civics lesson. It isn't a lecture on the levels of government, but it's much more meeting people where they are and talking about what matters. It integrates staff training and engagement. We also have an evaluation component so that we can be continually learning about what works, not only for the individual participants, but also the organizations. It's been a rough year, as we all know, for political institutions at all levels of government, including in this city, where, as you all know, our motto is diversity is our strength. And I hope you all agree that we haven't done nearly enough to unleash the force of this diversity when it comes to our democratic life. So it's been inspiring and to hear and to see some of that happening at North York, and we hope in more places. There was a wonderful observation a participant who moved here from Russia made, where he said, "A fish rots from the head down, but you have to clean it from the bottom up." And I was like, yeah, it's true. So this wisdom, of course, reminds us that, I would like to say foundation, those of us at the foundation, but we need to take responsibility, of course, for cleaning up the system and helping other people do that. If you're interested in learning more, we are hosting a Train the Trainers for other organizations on May 6th, together with our friends at Maytree Social Planning Toronto and at the Toronto Neighbourhood Centres. So John, Alejandro and Rob are all here, and maybe I can trouble you to raise your hands if people have questions they can ask them. And we also have sign-out sheets at the Samara booth outside. So just a little, if you're interested in that, we can share more with you. Alan, thank you for the little plug for Tragedy of the Commons. This is coming at the other end of the fish, the head end of the fish. We did a series of exit interviews with 80 former members of Parliament where we talked to them about many of the same issues that concern us, why politics aren't working the way that they should. And we have published what they said in a book with Random House called Tragedy in the Commons. It's not available in stores till April 15th, and so this is a secret, but we do have a handful of boxes out front, so those books are for sale if you are interested. So it's a little behind the scenes from the head of the fish. But now back to the foundation of the fish. I know that now we're all turning into circles to talk a little bit, and you're free to obviously talk about whatever you'd like, but here we've just put a couple of questions that I know we're certainly grappling with at Samara about Democracy Talks that I'd love anyone's input in. How do we focus attention on engagement and not just access to the polls? There's a huge opportunity in this election coming up, and we've got enough time in between to really think about that engagement piece. And then what in your experience has motivated people to get engaged? For those who care about issues, what motivates past just caring about the issues into action? Or for what, besides concern over an issue, encourages people to get involved in campaigns? So just some questions to talk about, although you can talk about whatever you'd like. And again, I thank you very much for having me today and look forward to the rest of the day.